Well, it is 6 p.m., so we should begin. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Michael King, and I'm the Executive Director of the Southwest Seattle Historical Society. I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's Words, Writers, and Southwest Stories presentation, which will be delivered by Professor James Gregory of the University of Washington. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that the Southwest Seattle Historical Society and our Log House Museum are located on the traditional land of the Duwamish people, past and present, and I'd like to honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. This evening's session is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, For Culture and Luna Park Cafe, as well as our partnership with the Seattle Public Library and the University of Washington. The Historical Society's mission is to promote local history through education, preservation, and advocacy. And as many of you are aware, we host a wide range of programmatic opportunities like the one we're about to enjoy this evening. However, I do want to remind you that next Tuesday, we're also hosting another digital program. We will be joined on October 13th by author and poet Sean Petrie, who's going to be presenting on his new book, Listen to the Trees, which is a poetic look at the history of West Seattle. So if you haven't registered for that, I'd encourage you to do so on our website, which is loghousemuseum.org. I should also add before we begin that the Historical Society can't host programs like the one we're enjoying together this evening without your support. So if you're interested in making a donation, I'm going to post a link to our donation page in the chat momentarily. Finally, given the size of our audience this evening, and we should have some late arrivals, we're going to utilize the Q&A function for our question and answer session. That function should be down at the bottom of your screen, in the bottom of the Zoom window. If you have a question for Professor Gregory, please enter that into the Q&A feature, and I will field those questions for you at the end of the presentation. With all of that said, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's presenter, Professor James Gregory. Professor Gregory is the Williams Family Endowed Professor of History at the University of Washington. His research and teaching focus on aspects of 20th century United States history, including labor history, regionalism, race and civil rights history, and migration. He earned his PhD at the University of California, Berkeley in 1983, and he currently serves as the director of the Pacific Northwest Labor and Civil Rights Projects. He's the author of American Exodus, as well as The Southern Diaspora, and this evening he is presenting on the Seattle General Strike. The Historical Society is thrilled that Professor Gregory has joined us this evening for Words, Writers, and Southwest Stories, so I will turn things over to him at this time. Welcome, Professor Gregory.
Michael, thank you very much. That was very nice of you, and it's a pleasure to be here. I hope everybody can see things. I'm going to try to share the screen so that you can see the slideshow that I've prepared. And while I'm doing that, I need to issue a little warning. I have a little dog who likes to bark when other dogs come by. So at some moments we may be interrupted, and I apologize in advance, but those of you who have pets know that they don't always listen to us. In any case, so I want to take you back to a simpler time, a time before COVID, before the economic crisis and the life and death presidential elections, a time when wildfires were not raging up and down the West Coast. It was a time when in Seattle, the thing that people most cared about was snow. Remember early February 2019? Snowmageddon, as we called it then. The other thing that was going on that week of February 2019 was a commemoration of the 100th anniversary of one of the pivotal events in Seattle's history, the 1919 General Strike. The King County Labor Council, the scheduled events, as did MOHI, the University of Washington, many city and public agencies were involved in this, and you can see the logo that was produced and used during that month, Solidarity Centennial, 100 years. One of the other things that happened was, after a year of working on it, was the University of Washington. The University of Washington issued a new book that was also an old book about the general strike. And it was published a month before the commemoration, just in time to use it. Let me read you the opening paragraphs that I wrote to introduce that volume. Streetcar gongs ceased their clamor. Newsboys cast their unsold papers into the street. From the doors of mill and factory, store and workshop streamed 65,000 working men. School children with fear in their hearts hurried homeward. The life stream of a great city stopped. Thus begins a highly dramatized description of the start of the February 1919 general strike, written by Seattle's flamboyant mayor, Ole Hansen, who would claim in the same account that he had saved the city from, and the nation, by defeating Bolshevism in Seattle. Second paragraph. The Seattle general strike earned headlines across the nation and across oceans. In an extraordinary act of solidarity, members of more than 100 unions had voted to stop work in support of shipyard workers who were already on strike. The announcement that all unions would join this solidarity strike, a general strike, an attempt to shut down the city, came less than 3 months after the end of World War I. It came at a time when joy of peace had begun to mix with concern and confusion. Insurrections are spreading across Europe, inspired by the recent Bolshevik revolution in Russia. Newspapers told of bloody battles in the streets of Germany, Hungary, and northern Italy. Revolutionary ideas were also spreading among American workers, and signs of unrest were everywhere. Was this call for a general strike a signal for something more? Was it a revolution in Seattle, as the New York Times declared in a front page headline? So that was part of my introduction to a book originally published 56 years earlier in 1964, written by Robert Friedheim, with much help from Robin Friedheim. Here is the original author and his wife. As I was preparing this centennial edition, Robert is no longer alive, but Robin is very much so, and she was a great help, and she told me something of the story of this book. Apparently, it was actually her idea in the first place, and she did much of the research, quite a bit of the writing, but he was an assistant professor and needed to get tenure. So, this being 1964 and academic politics, her name doesn't appear on the book, only his. Very sad, but in other ways, it's a wonderful resource. So, you know, a couple years ago when UW Press asked me to write a new book on this subject, I suggested reprinting this one instead and agreed to bring it up to date with an extensive introduction, a photo essay, and an afterword. It's really quite a wonderful book. Friedheim's account is remarkable. He produced a narrative that takes us deep into the deliberations and decisions made by workers, union activists, business and civic leaders. It's a fast-moving account, riveting in detail, sparkling prose. You'll love it. In my parts of the book, I add context, incorporate newer research, and examine the legacies of the strike for our region, indeed for the United States. I make the point that the events of 1919 literally put Seattle on the map. Prior to 1919, Seattle was a little-known city lodged in the extreme northwest corner, you know, the damp corner of the United States. By February of that year, it was on the headlines of newspapers around the world. And to some extent, the sense of knowing Seattle has never stopped. Certainly, the story of the general strike remains known in some surprising places. So let me tell you a little personal story to start us off. About a dozen years ago, my family and I were in Amsterdam, sitting in an outdoor cafe. The city was hosting one of the rounds of the World Cup. And next to us sat a group of young men from Slovenia, decked out in Slovenian colors and weird hats. And by weird hats, I mean sort of Dr. Seuss cat in the hat hats. One young man heard us talking and wanted to practice his English, so he asked, where are you from? Seattle, I said. His eyes brightened. Seattle Sonics, he said, and then added, Seattle General Strike. Pretty strange, I thought. Not Starbucks, not Microsoft, not Boeing. Seattle General Strike was what he knew about our city. Now, it made me wonder what they're teaching in Slovenian high schools. And we'll kind of get back to the Slovenian. We're certainly going to talk about how that story got where it gets. First, I want to show you pictures and narrate briefly the events of the strike, reading some passages to show you the exquisite prose and pace that makes Friedheim's account so valuable. When the United States declared war on Germany in April 1917, Seattle was quickly transformed into a wartime boomtown. And there's some interesting parallels with today's Amazon boomtown. The demography was similar. In both cases, thousands of young men arrive in Seattle, many with advanced technical skills. In 1917, they came to build ships. Under federal contract, shipbuilding had become the city's dominant industry, employing 35,000 workers. Unions had been active in Seattle from the time it was more town than city, and by the 1910s had achieved mass membership and political influence. By 1919, the Seattle Labor Council represented 110 union locals. The Seattle Union Record, which you can see here, was owned by, as a daily newspaper, owned by the Labor Council, selling up to 60,000 copies a day. So it's a major part of the media system of the city. Among the unions were a number representing female workers, an indication of the strength and progressive tone of the Seattle labor movement. The waitresses union, shown here, was one example. Others included laundry workers union, lady barbers union, and unions of garment workers, candy makers, hotel workers, and telephone operators. The region had also developed a reputation for radicalism and had become a base city for the industrial workers of the world, the IWW, shown here. The IWW was driven mostly underground during World War I, as government raids and repression targeted that organization and other radicals. But hundreds of wobblies, as they were known, were working in the Seattle shipyards. The war ended on November 11th, 1918, and here, as elsewhere, people rushed into the streets to celebrate. It was a mistake. The flu pandemic had already killed more than 1,000 people in King County, and now would kill more as it reignited. Here you can see employees of a downtown firm obeying the emergency order requiring face masks. Sounds somewhat similar, actually look similar. They look like the masks I wear most of the time. In any case, so this was a complicated moment where joy and tragedy mixed. The end of hostilities also unleashed expectations, especially among workers who had agreed to wage freezes during the war. After negotiating for months over what workers thought was a promised war-end wage increase, the unions representing 35,000 shipyard workers declared a strike in late January 1919 and proceeded to shut down the shipbuilding facilities throughout Puget Sound. Here you can see workers walking off the job of the Skinner and Eddy plant yard, which is near the site of the current football stadium. The shipyard workers then appealed to the Central Labor Council for support. The Central Labor Council was, and is today, a coordinating body that attempts to represent the combined interests of the city's local unions. There were 110 unions affiliated in 1990. The shipyard workers asked the council to pledge to strike in sympathy. So let me read you another passage. Night after night, as locals held their meetings, votes for a general strike continued to roll in. Electrical workers, Local 77, Millman workers, Local 338, leather workers, Local 40, hotel maids, Local 528, and the jewelry workers, Local, all certified officially that their members were willing to strike. But most significant were the results from the well-established conservative locals with strong craft traditions. To the astonishment of the Seattle Times, they announced a stunningly lopsided plurality in favor of the general strike. The 600-man Cooks and Assistants Local 33 reported that its members voted 5-1 for the general strike. By a margin of 16-1, House Painters and Decorators Local 300 came out in favor of striking. So I think what I like about that is the list gives us a sense of how many different unions were operating, representing about a third of all people with jobs in Seattle and the area. Eventually, 101 unions would vote to join the strike. The unions then elected delegates to serve on a strike committee which met at the Labor Temple to coordinate activities. Here the union record announces the strike decision 3 days before the deadline. Big headline. With enthusiasm running high, these strikers, this is a few days before the strike, and family members collect supplies at one of the local affiliated cooperative stores who are authorized to remain open during the strike. On February 4th, 2 days before the strike, the Union Record published on the front page a stirring editorial by Anna Louise Strong, pictured here. She was an editor of the newspaper. The editorial raised the temperature of events, and you can see the language here. This is front page. There will be cheering. I'm sorry, I'm blogging, I can't read parts of this, but the important parts are, we are undertaking the most important, most tremendous move ever made by labor in this country. A move which will lead no one knows where. We do not need hysteria. We need the iron march of labor. Labor will feed the people. And then below that, labor will care for the babies. And there are other commitments of what labor is going to do as it runs the city. So this was very stirring and exciting to those who were in favor of the strike, but pretty scary for others. And quite quickly, conservatives and moderates who were not part of the labor movement took alarm at this plan. You can see the Seattle Star, which before this had been sort of a labor-friendly kind of liberal newspaper, says in no uncertain terms, stop before it's too late, and warns that, that this could lead to violence and revolution. The labor movement had miscalculated. The unions had counted on the Star. There were more conservative newspapers like the Seattle Times, but they'd counted on the Star, and Mayor Hansen was seen as a former progressive, not a conservative. They'd counted on the mayor and the city council to remain neutral in this strike, but that's not what happened. It was a miscalculation. Hansen quickly came out, as did the Star, warning against this, and then proceeded to deputize hundreds of law and order volunteers, many of them recently discharged soldiers. In this photo, men are issued weapons at the police headquarters. Here's how Friedheim sets the scene in the day before the strike. Store shelves were empty the day before the strike. Grocery shops were reportedly Completely out of staples, patent medicines, bandages, and other supplies were hard to find. Druggists reported a last-minute demand for prescription renewals. Another item in which Seattle shoppers showed abnormal interest was guns. The supply lagged far behind demand. Numerous Seattle families sat behind closed blinds and locked doors on the night of February 5th, cleaning rifles, shotguns, and pistols, with fathers instructing wives and teenage sons in their use. The wealthy prepared for the strike by packing. Many of Seattle's better-known families found early February a convenient time to take a midwinter vacation. Okay, so that's the scene. And a little more about the unions and the labor movement. The unions preparing to strike practiced whites-only unionism, almost all of them, what we now call Jim Crow unionism. The longshore workers were different, and there were a few that were not. But this was standard in the American Federation of Labor, and Seattle was no different than other cities. In 1919, Japanese Americans comprised the largest community of color in Seattle, and Japanese barbers, butchers, dye makers had formed separate unions, separate from the AFL. The Japanese Labor Association represented men working in the canneries and lumber camps. Surprisingly, all these organizations agreed to honor the strike, even though they were shut out of the main unions. The Central Labor Council welcomed the endorsement, surprise, and allowed the Japanese Labor Association to send delegates to the meetings. But, here's the but, they were not allowed to vote. Earl George, shown here much later in his life, was a longshoreman and World War I veteran. He was one of the few African Americans active in the strike. Years later, he recalled the eerie calm that descended over the city in the first days of the shutdown, explaining in memorable terms that, quote, nothing moved but the tide. So the strike begins February 6th, a Thursday, and the city is eerily quiet. With streetcars not operating, there are few people on the street. Even businesses that employed non-union people shut down, not wanting to chance anything. So 40,000 additional workers, additional to the 65,000 who are on strike, now 40,000 additional workers are staying home. And the city isn't moving because there are very few cars. When the streetcars shut, nothing's really moving. Now here's what's interesting. The strike was entirely peaceful. There was no disorder and not a single arrest for strike-related activity. This was intentional. The strike committee knew that what destroyed strikes was any kind of violence that could invite police intervention. So they told members of unions to stay home, stay off the streets. And they set up a patrol, called it Labor's War Veterans Guard. These are returning veterans, members of union, who wore white armbands and walked the streets telling strikers to go home. So there were no picket lines, there were no marches, there were no other demonstrations, just quiet. Meanwhile, the strike committee is attempting to run things. Of critical importance are the dining stations, since nearly all restaurants and cafes are closed, and many single persons lack kitchen facilities. So you see the members of the Waiters and Waitresses Union serving food to men who need to eat in one of 21 dining stations in schools and elsewhere. And the Seattle Union Record proclaiming the wheels have stopped turning. This is one of the few street scene photographs that we have, and it may not have been a gathering of strikers. This is the intersection of 7th and Union. It's a block from the Labor Temple, where people were gathering, but it's also close to the Seattle Star printing press. And these men may have been waiting to buy a newspaper. People are desperate for news, and all the newspapers had shut down on the first day of the strike. So on the second day, as the Seattle Star is beginning to print, and the newsboys are on strike, so there's no way that this is getting distributed. People in this scene may have been gathering to buy the newspaper directly from the printing plant. We don't really know. In any case, one of the few street scenes and an indication of the quiet that had descended over the city. Although everything was peaceful, on day 2, Mayor Hansen threatens martial law unless the strike is called off immediately. He lacks the authority to carry out the threat. You can see his proclamation in the Seattle Star, but it's still a very potent symbol. Meanwhile, 2 battalions of U.S. Army troops have arrived from Camp Lewis. They've been issued live ammunition and are stationed at strategic locations, including this contingent at the National Guard Armory, then on Western Avenue. With no sign that federal authorities in charge of the shipyards are willing to negotiate and no hope of working with the mayor, strike morale crumbles. Over the weekend, several unions announced that they're returning to work on Monday. The strike committee asks them to hold off, and as the Sunday headline declares, they plan to keep going. But that resolve doesn't last very long. On Monday, these headlines in the afternoon newspapers indicate that the strike committee is ending things, and as of Tuesday, after 6 days, on the 6th day, the strike will end. So you can see the Union Record on the one hand and the Seattle Times on the other hand, both declaring that the strike is over. So, what does this all mean? There's been considerable debate about the aftermath. Robert Friedheim concluded that the strike had been a mistake, a disaster, he said. I think this is a miscalculation and explain why in my part of the book. The Solidarity strikers went back to work, it's true, without fulfilling the goal of securing the contract for shipyard workers. The shipyard strike, on the other hand, continued for another 5 weeks, and then they too went back to work, having not realized their goals. And in addition, some unions that had declared for the sympathy strike suffered afterwards. They had, in some cases, broken contracts, and employers refused to deal with them. So there were consequences, and some unions were troubled by this. But in general, the sense that this was a disaster rests on a kind of sports mentality. You know, you either win or you lose. There's nothing in between. There's nothing other than winning or losing. And on those grounds, yeah, okay, they didn't win. But there's a lot more to think about here. And I have the benefit of subsequent research by a number of scholars, especially Dana Frank, whose book called Purchasing Power examines the Seattle labor movement in the 1920s in the aftermath of the strike. And she explains that in the months following, the labor movement continued to expand. Union membership grew. New locals were organized. Readership of the Seattle Union Record increased. In addition, in what Frank describes as a cooperative fever, Seattle unions poured resources and energies into union-owned or consumer-owned cooperative enterprises. Here is a cooperative grocery store, one example. This included more than a dozen grocery stores, restaurants, a slaughterhouse and sausage-making plant, bakeries, a dairy, and most prominently, a labor-owned bank. So this, in the aftermath, there's more and more excitement, not less, and the labor movement for a time grows in enthusiasm and to some extent effectiveness. In the long term, the shipyard shut down, a great recession, I guess, depression they called it then, descends over the entire country in 1920 and 21, and lots of people lose jobs. Seattle goes into a deep Depression as the federal government says, well, let's just shut those shipyards so lots of workers leave. So in the aftermath, in the early 20s, things are not good for the labor movement or for Seattle in general, but that's not a result of the strike. That's a result of the national economy and also national politics. So another way to think about this is that the events in Seattle had consequences beyond Seattle. And this is, here's where I want you to think about the story. You know, events sometimes produce stories, which then have a life of their own. The story of the Seattle General Strike moved far and has had, over the course of a century, quite an effect. So one of those effects was to stir up or help inspire a strike wave that spread across the country. Just a few months later in May, unions in Winnipeg, some of them having heard about what went on in Seattle, launched their own general strike. It has different results. It wasn't entirely peaceful and it wasn't short. It lasted 6 weeks and the strike ended in violence when the Royal Canadian Mounted Police fired into a crowd of strikers and sympathizers, killing 2, wounding 30. So very different kind of outcome. But also in the spring and summer and fall of 1919 was one of the greatest strike waves in American history. Hundreds of thousands, ultimately millions of workers in many, many different locales and unions on strike. In September 1919, some 350,000 steel workers began a walkout that involved mills in 80 cities and lasted 3 months. And here you see the police in Boston engaged in a strike. So the Seattle General Strike set off, might have happened without it or not, but certainly helped inspire now follow-up strikes across the country. There's another, the story is also moving into a different political location. It's inspiring conservatism. It helps inspire the Red Scare that breaks out with big consequences in 1920. And part of the inspiration comes from our dear mayor at that time, Ole Hansen. Ole Hansen is an interesting guy. In February, in the midst of this, he's getting big headlines, especially the New York Times and others, who are calling him the savior of Seattle. And it goes to his head. He pretty quickly, just a couple months later, resigns as mayor and thinks he's going to run for president of the United States. And the first thing he does is he writes an inflammatory book, Americanism versus Bolshevism, and then goes on the road and spends months and months crisscrossing the country, giving well-paid speeches to conservative audiences in city after city, trying to stir up anxiety about radicalism, claiming that he has stopped Bolshevism in Seattle and that he knows how to stop the Reds everywhere. He didn't win the nomination for presidency, but this was one of the many reasons stirring up fear of radicals. And you can see in 2020, there will be massive roundups of socialists, communists, IWWs, and other radicals. So the story of the General Strike was doing this kind of productive work, on both sides, or many parts of the political spectrum. And what's interesting is that it continues, and it not only is doing that kind of work for social movements then, but it becomes part of the reputation of Seattle. As the story moves, so does the idea that something unique has happened in Seattle. So what I'm saying is that the Seattle General Strike helped to produce a political reputation that's still with us today. A reputation of Seattle as a place where various kind of expressions of radicalism take hold, not necessarily that it's a radical city, but there's a place for radicalism in Seattle. And this reputation then got cemented at various points in time, again in the 1930s, certainly when many labor movements, when the labor movement sort of was reborn, became radical again, and political energies, some of it led and associated with the Communist Party, helped elect a lot of left-leaning politicians to the state. And that story that, okay, Washington's a pretty left place, took life in a very interesting quote, an article that some of you may be familiar with. This was James Farley, who was running FDR's re-election campaign. At one point, he apparently quips, at least he's quoted by Mary McCarthy as saying, there are 47 states in the Union and the Soviet of Washington. Clearly a left-wing place. So this reputation then, moves sort of, is renewed generation by generation. In 1919, another kind of world famous event, the WTO demonstrations on the streets of Seattle at the very end of the millennium, again, reproducing this idea that circulates in places like maybe Slovenia, that Seattle is unique, or one of the places where radicalism has a real home. Now, I want to sort of think about that a little theoretically as we wrap this up. In addition to studying labor and civil rights movements, I'm a historian of migration. A couple of my books are about migration and how that matters and what it means. So I want to bring a little migration theory into this. Here's a map showing the recent imbalance of in-migration to versus out-migration to King County. We attract people, that's what we do. And we've been doing it for 150 years. People coming here much more frequently than they're leaving here. And they come here for very predictable reasons for the most part. It's mostly about jobs, military bases, colleges, relatives, all the reasons that most people move. But some people come for other reasons, or at least visit and think about moving here. So I'd like to read to you, as we wrap up, my last two paragraphs in the book, okay? Memories of the general strike. There's a little diagram that shows the theory here. Event, story, migration. Anyway, memories of the general strike have had a subtle but meaningful effect on who comes to Seattle, and thus on the area's politics and culture. Over the years, stories of the general strike and Seattle's reputation for radicalism have drawn both visitors and settlers to the city on Puget Sound. I was one. In 1974, I drove north with a friend from my home in California to see the Pacific Northwest. What I knew about Washington State was simple: trees and wobblies. With images derived from reading John Dos Passos and Ralph Chaplin on my mind, I was on the trail of the IWW, of Centralia, and the Seattle General Strike. For at least one college student, Seattle was the General Strike. I didn't stay in 1974, but jumped at the chance to return 19 years later. Selective migration is one of the most interesting aspects of the legacy of the General Strike. 1919 gave Seattle a reputation that's been reproduced by generations ever since. Reproduced partly through selective migration of people who know and appreciate the city's labor and radical history, and who think that something interesting may be happening in this far northwest corner of the United States. And that expectation becomes self-fulfilling as these newcomers fuel new waves of political activism, helping to renew the city's reputation as a progressive and sometimes radical place, as the city of the General Strike. Now, none of that exactly explains the Slovenian young person who knew about it, and I don't know how. I find that amusing, but it provoked me in some very interesting ways. So I'm going to end there and look forward to questions, and I'm going to see if I can get out of shared screen. Yes. Okay, I'm out.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for that presentation, Professor Gregory. We do have a couple of questions, and for those of you that may have questions, as a friendly reminder, please type them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. The first question that we have for you this evening is, what was the population of Seattle during the strike? What percentage of the population may have actually participated in this action?
So if I remember correctly, in 1920, the census doesn't come in 1990. In 1920, I think they counted 315,000 people. So you could say 300,000. So the 65,000 estimated to be parts belong to unions and going out on strike were close to half of all the people with paid jobs. About half of the working population. And as I mentioned, a lot of other people didn't go to work either because employers or they thought, well, it's not safe. Anyway, so it was a big portion of the population that was involved in unions at that point and participating in the strike.
Wonderful, thank you. The next question we have for you is, what was the goal of the strike? I guess if you could speak to that a little bit more, we have a participant that would love to hear about that.
So the goal was remarkably generous and simple on its face. They just wanted to support the shipyard workers who felt that they had been cheated out of a wage increase that they thought was promised. So the shipyard workers were fighting for wages, but all these other people, 101 unions, went out with no expectation that they were going to get a dime out of this. And some worry, and it was the case, that they were going to get punished for it. So it was this act of solidarity, and that's part of why the story inspired generations of other labor activists, because here is this quite selfless act on behalf of their brothers, and they talked in terms of gender terms of brothers, in a union. All these other workers are going out to help them. It's a sympathy strike. So on its face, it was, very generous and all about solidarity. Now, the political context and the sense of what labor movements try to do make it somewhat a little more complicated. So labor movements, well, at that particular time, 1919, the end of World War I, there was a sense of a crisis brewing, and conservatives thought of it as, oh my God, there's a Russian Revolution, radicals are going to take over everything here, there's going to be a revolution here. But on the other side, the labor movement, quite broadly, worried about a conservative backlash. And employers had been talking about taking back some of the gains that unions had made during World War I. A lot of the federal government had pretty much encouraged employers to tolerate unions, and so unions had grown. And the labor movement thought that they were about to see an employer offensive, an open shop campaign. So both sides were pretty anxious and worried. And it's quite clear that the Central Labor Council thought that it was really important to support the shipyard workers in order to make it clear that there was going to be no going back, that the labor movement was going to be strong. And so the open shop conservatives should just back off. So that's what so there were bigger stakes involved. And that worry about the open shop campaign came true. It came true in Seattle after the strike. In the early 20s, employers across the country took advantage of the recession, took advantage of the Red Scare, again, sort of worrying about politics, but big employers declared open shop campaigns and broke unions and broke contracts and tried to eliminate unions from their shops, and were somewhat successful, so that the labor movement in general through the 1920s declined in strength and numbers.
Thank you. We have another question. Related to the general strike was the Everett massacre a few years earlier. What was the issue in Everett and why all the violence there?
Well, it's related, sort of, I guess. It's part of a, but I mean, it's really not the same. So in 1916, before World War I, the mill workers in Everett was a lumber mill town, Cedar Shingles. It was like this shingle capital of the world, and huge numbers of workers were working in the shingle mills, and they were part of a union that went on strike in 1916, and that strike was failing. And the IWW, which is a very radical organization, got involved at that point to support the failing mill workers strike. They began trying to hold rallies and do other things in Everett. The city government in Everett, particularly the sheriff of Snohomish County, was very conservative, very anti-union and anti-wobbly. So there were these clashes with the IWW and beatings of IWW workers. And then finally in November of 1916, the IWW thought it would try a new approach. So they rented one of the Mosquito fleet, the little ship called the Verona, 300 wobblies from Seattle boarded. They sailed to Everett, and when they got to Everett, the sheriff was ready and had deputized many, businessmen in town, and they were armed and ready, and a gunfight broke out as the Verona tried to dock, and 5 wobblies were killed, 2 deputies were killed, and it's possible that the death toll was even higher. But that's what the Everett massacre was about. It was a collision between the IWW and the sheriff and business leaders of Everett.
Thank you. I have a question for you that came to mind. You mentioned that the labor movement grows. You see general strikes embraced in cities, for instance, like Winnipeg. So you see it spreading. And you also mentioned that the strike had implications on a broader scale across the political spectrum. And I'm wondering if you see any other groups outside of the labor movement that kind of recognize the relative efficacy of the general strike as an approach to kind of conveying a grievance against a different issue. Do you see that embraced as an approach outside of the labor movement on a widespread scale in the years after the Seattle strike?
Well, that's an interesting question. So, throughout kind of American history, first I should say Seattle is sometimes said to be the first general strike, which it really wasn't. It was kind of the first of the 20th century and sort of had different meanings of the general strike than the previous century. But in any case, and there haven't been a huge number organized by labor unions. In 1934, there was a general strike in San Francisco around longshore workers, and there've been one in Oakland, and there've been several of them, but it's not something that union movements have mostly thought this is probably too dangerous, too complicated, too dangerous. And that's true kind of around the world, I guess. So it's not really something that in those terms was repeated a lot. But I think the story of the general strike in other ways was very inspiring in later generations. And the fact that Friedheim wrote a book 56 years ago, and I helped bring it back. And we did this commemoration on the 100th anniversary, but there have been commemorations basically every 10 years in this city. And so it's something that, especially the labor movement, it's a story the labor movement wants to keep alive. Because for unions, what was really powerful about this was the fact that it was entirely peaceful. That so many people came together out of an act of solidarity as opposed to self-interest. In this spirit of one for all, you know, we're together, we will defend each other, which is what labor movements preach and teach and sort of need. But the Seattle General Strike becomes this great example of it that they like to talk about and that, you know, others like to talk about. So 50 years ago, I guess it's 50 years ago, yeah, in 1969, student radicals at the University of Washington, part of SDS, had a big event to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Seattle General Strike. And so they're not union activists, but they're social activists, they're radical activists, and they found that story of people standing together for each other out of a sense of solidarity as opposed to self-interest, and doing so in an entirely peaceful fashion. That was the other thing that was so, you know, the Winnipeg General Strike doesn't get the same celebration, and some of the, but this idea that for 6 days, nothing moved but the tide, and for 6 days, the union movement and working people tried to run the city. The ambitiousness of that, the generosity of it, the solidarity of it, that's a story that unions like, and that other social movements like, you know, whether it was student activists, civil rights activists, and, you know, and so actually in the last 20 years, the various sort of demonstrations have been called general strikes, or there have been sort of one-day demonstrations. So the Occupy movement of 2011, 2012, tried to call a general strike. They actually sort of articulated what they were doing as at least a one-day general strike. And even more interestingly, some of you will remember back to 2006, the immigrant rights demonstrations, when Congress, Republican Congress, passed very harsh anti-immigrant law that hit a lot of people by surprise, that there were explosions of demonstrations coming out of the Chicano Latino communities mostly. It started in Los Angeles, and Chicago, Seattle, huge marches. We had 50,000 people. And on May Day of that year, the organizers, this was kind of a movement that spread by contagion, began to make the call for a day without immigrants to demonstrate the labor power of immigrant workers. And they were calling for a one-day general strike. And there hundreds of thousands of people in many cities participate. So there have been, you know, short general strikes that actually reflect that spirit of 1919 in the sense that they're not looking for anything for themselves. It's a gesture of solidarity. It's a gesture of coming together, of protest, and it's intended to make an important statement about social justice. So I like that question. That was a great question.
Thank you. We have another question from the audience. The Roaring 20s is concomitant with the thinking of labor in the 20s. Is that a correct view? What was the status of the labor movement during the Great Depression?
So the 20s was not an easy period for any of the unions, and the radical organizations, the IWW, the Socialist Party, and there was a brand new Communist Party in the 1920s. All of them had real troubles. They were under federal and state kinds of measures against them. And even more conservative unions typically had trouble. That term roaring 20s is, you know, a little misnomer, but that decade starts with a bad depression, which really broke a lot of unions. And then the talk about prosperity and the like seemed to work in favor of employers who convinced many workers not to join unions. So the 20s became hard for unions. But in the Great Depression, which starts right at the very end of the 20s, the first 3 years of the 1930s, huge unemployment, really hard on the existing unions. But after Roosevelt is elected and the economy begins to resurge in 1933 and 1934, the labor movement comes back and builds stronger than ever. And new kinds of unions under the CIO, as opposed to the AFL, are more progressive, radical in some cases, and powerful. So the labor movement has a seesaw effect like this. Some decades are really tough, others for where things are rebuilding. 20s were tough. The late 30s become the period when organized labor is actually, you know, growing its strongest.
Thank you. I have another question for you. You spoke about Mayor Hansen then in the wake of the strike, essentially going on tour and galvanizing conservatives or warning conservatives about what might come. Do you see kind of a foil within the labor movement that emerges out of Seattle that really becomes a voice around the country, galvanizing these types of demonstrations, or is it, I guess, dispersed among union leaders, more generally speaking?
So it sounds like there's several parts to that. I think what I was trying to indicate is that, you know, there are different stories that kind of circulate. It's like some people are getting on trains and they're union activists and they're going to Winnipeg and they're going to Chicago and they're telling about the great events in Seattle from a labor perspective. And then Ole Hansen is getting on trains and he's going out and warning about the radicals in Seattle. And so it's really quite different. Both, I think, very potent in the immediate aftermath. You know, Ole Hansen is one of a number of people who, you know, were kind of building a Red Scare. They were literally out there lecturing about the threats of radicalism, which then explode in 1920 and 21 with some really severe deportations of people and the like. Yeah, so they're somewhat different. Ole Hansen then has a whole other life, which is pretty interesting. I don't know if anybody knows Southern California and the city of San Clemente, where Richard Nixon's library was. After he retired, he built San Clemente. This is north of San Diego, between San Diego and LA. It's this charming beach community. Well, Ole Hansen built San Clemente. And if you happen to go there, you'll see the community center is the Ole Hansen Community Center. So apparently after his presidential campaign failed, he was running on the he wanted to be Republican candidate in 1920. So that's going nowhere. But he had made quite a lot of money on this speaking tour, and possibly from his book, but mostly the speaking fees. So he took that money and moved to, you know, Southern California and bought vacant land near the beach, subdivided it. He had been a real estate developer in this region first, but now in Southern California, right at the boom, you know, Los Angeles is starting to grow like crazy and Southern California is attracting ultimately millions. And Ole Hansen was there to, you know, make his pot of money. He, you know, he had enough of politics, time to do real estate.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from the audience? If so, please type them into the Q&A. Professor Gregory, where is the book available? Is it available through the University of Washington Press?
Sure, and Amazon and any place that you can get books these days. We have so few bookstores anymore, and anyway, poor booksellers, I don't know. But yeah, it's available wherever, and the libraries have it. So I do, you know, I think it's a great read, and it's a really important part of our history together. So give it a try.
Well, wonderful. I think that those are all of the questions we have for you this evening. I want to thank you again for your wonderful presentation and the magnificent answers to the questions you provided for us. We have a couple of comments. Thanks for the discussion, and can you come back and talk about Dave Beck?
Building the Teamsters Union, yeah. He was another character.
Well, we've got a lot of comments coming in thanking you for your presentation this evening. And again, I can't thank you enough for joining us this evening. We really enjoyed the presentation. I want to thank again all of our sponsors for culture, Luna Park Cafe, as well as the Seattle Public Libraries and the University of Washington that helped to make this possible. And of course, thanks to everyone that joined us this evening. I hope you enjoyed the session. We really appreciate your support, and I hope you'll be able to join us next week for our program on Tuesday evening. Apart from that, again, if you're interested in supporting the Historical Society through a donation, please visit our website at loghousemuseum.org. Thank you again for joining us. I hope you all stay well and healthy, and I will be looking forward to connecting with you very soon. Take care.